There are three things you can do to help us out.
1, you can make sure you subscribe to this channel.
2 is you can leave a comment here or on Apple Podcasts.
And 3, if you really want to help, you can follow this link to see how you could be a supporter on Patreon.
Word in Your Attic, a Zoom with a view.
Welcome to another Word in Your Attic, where we're joined by a musician who's just published an absolutely fantastic memoir. It's called Limited Edition of One. I'm going to give you a little tiny taste of it. This is the moment where he's formed his band Porcupine Tree. And so it was that the band began, obsessed with these obscure and mysterious albums created by trailblazing eccentrics from a bygone age, each with their own mythology. This couldn't be further up our street. It's the great Stephen Wilson. Lovely to see you.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. Thank you.
No, and what a great collection of records. You were just saying earlier, you actually have steps in order to access your records. There are so many of them, you actually need to go up a step ladder.
Well, they go up high, yes. But, you know, the funny thing is I've been gradually shedding records the last year. During lockdown, I've been increasingly looking at my collection and thinking to myself, why have I got that? I don't even like it. But it's one of the things about collecting, isn't it? You end up being a completist with certain artists, and there's certain catalogues of certain artists where I probably like about 3 of their records, and the other 20 I just have because I feel like I have to have the. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. You feel it. It's kind of it's you've got to have them as a kind of sign of how earnest you are about the way you feel about the 3 that are good.
But also, isn't it a classic case of when you're fond of somebody, you feel that everything that they're going to produce must be great, and you have willed yourself to like it completely. And it's only years later you go, actually, let's be honest, that was terrible.
Well, I think it's partly that, and also it's partly the fascination that the music nerd has with the trajectory of a career. So you're as fascinated by the misfires as you are by the big successes.
Right. Yes,
but there comes a point sometimes with an artist that you loyally just keep on buying their records year after year, and there's a certain point, the watershed moment, where you kind of lose that, and then you go back and you just rampage through the whole back catalogue and get rid of most of it. And I've been doing that with a few artists, I've got to say, recently. Yeah.
So who have you taken out and shot, to put it that way?
Well, I'm very reluctant to say, because it's not a very nice thing to say. But let's just say there are certain artists I've been very blindly loyal to, no longer.
Right. Because you mentioned in the book, I think, Frank Zappa for a while, did you?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa is a great example. I think it's impossible for anyone to like every Frank Zappa record, even the most diehard.
Oh, absolutely. God.
Even the most
They're so different.
Yeah, completely. How could you like everything? But of course, he's one of those guys. He's a great example of what I'm talking about. You become fascinated with that whole sort of body of work, that oeuvre. So yes, you do sit there and try and convince yourself that the Synclavier albums are, you know, worth listening to, or the doo-wop. And I got to that point with Zappa a long time ago where I no longer felt that loyalty. So there you are. There's an example. I probably halved my Zappa collection.
That's fair.
That's still a lot of Frank Zappa.
No shame.
And I still think he's one of the only people truly deserving of the phrase genius, the expression.
All right.
So yes, but no, I can't honestly say I like all his records.
No. Well, can we transport you back, as we traditionally do in these conversations, to the family home? And can you remember the record playing equipment that was in it at the time, and the kind of things that were on it, and where it was? Where were you? Is it not Hemel Hempstead? Where was it?
I was born in Kingston on Thames, just around the corner from my friend Simon, who I think you know.
Yes.
Yeah. And my dad was an electronic engineer, so he built things. So he wouldn't go out and buy a hi-fi, he'd build one.
Fantastic.
So it was amazing. So we had this kind of old school reel-to-reel mounted in this wooden cabinet in the front room of the house. And my parents would record things from the radio onto that. So Pete Murray's Open House was a favorite, and they would record things off that. And that's how I got obsessed very early on with this whole process of editing and compiling, you know, being able to compile your own playlist essentially on a reel-to-reel tape. So they didn't have a lot of records, but they had a lot of tapes of their own sort of compilations, I guess, of things they liked that they'd recorded from the radio.
Right.
There was a key moment in the book where you're talking about the record "Love to Love You, Baby" by Donna Summer, which I thought was really interesting because David and I were talking about this the other day. We're now amazed that these records came out without any kind of sticker on them or whatever, because this was kind of played in family homes. But you were only how old when you heard that? Because it obviously the
6 or 7. No, well, when did it come out? It came out in 75, didn't it? I was about 8.
Yeah.
And
you thought of it as being, I think it was hypnotic and otherworldly rather than
I didn't know what she was doing. I didn't know what all those writhing and moaning sounds were, But I just fell in love with that whole notion of it being a track that took up the whole side of a record.
Yeah.
I thought that was amazing, and the fact that it was very groovy and very accessible, but it kept going through all these different kind of phases, and it would break down and then build up into something else. And a lot of people refer to me as being, progressive in that sense, and part of that kind of aesthetic, the progressive aesthetic, and it's absolutely in that track, because it's this journey that lasts for a whole side of a record, and it goes through all these different scenes. It's that idea of music as kind of analogous with cinema, that it goes through different scenes and different moods, but it's all part of a whole. And I've completely fell for that right from the very beginning, and it was that track, I think, that did it.
You know the story, was it Neil Bogart from Casablanca Records? He heard the demo and he said, you've got to make it long enough to soundtrack an orgy. And they said, well, how long was that? He said 14 minutes.
I experienced 14 minutes.
Kind of,
top
knew
whack.
Exactly.
I had no idea. So that's why they did that version then.
But also it's pre-automated, it's pre-kind of machine percussion, isn't it? It's a live band playing a Love to Love You, Baby. And so the drummer couldn't keep it going more than a certain amount of time. So they had to fade and restart, I think, basically.
Right. I mean, I'm guessing what they did with that is they probably did lots of different mixes of the main track with different kind of emphasis on different elements, and then found a way to edit them all together.
Put them together,
it's this long piece. Because I'm guessing the original master is only 4 or 5 minutes, as you say. So, but I love that. And then, of course, hearing that in heavy rotation with Dark Side of the Moon blew my mind, because it was the kind of, very kind of sensual groove orientated music and the very intellectual sound design elements of the Floyd record. This is like mind blowing to me. I'm like 7 or 8 years old. And this to me is kind of, those two records in a way are the very basis of my musical DNA. And I can hear it in everything I do in a way.
So when did you first start buying records for yourself?
So the first records I ever bought for myself, I remember the very first record I bought. The first single I bought was Carly Simon's Nobody Does It Better, which was obviously because it was the theme to the Bond movie at that time, which my dad had taken me to see. So that would have been 77, and I was 9 years old. And I remember, you guys remember this, you used to be able to buy singles from Rumbelows, an electric. And by this time we were living in Hemel Hempstead, and there were places like Woolworths and Rumbelows where you could buy the top 40 singles. So I started buying top 40 singles from Rumbelows. And I remember buying Donna Summer singles. I remember buying Follow You, Follow Me by Genesis, Wuthering Heights by Kate Bush, and some much less cool ones, which I'm, Yes Sir, I Can Boogie, Baccarat, I remember buying that. Bonnie Tyler's It's a Heartache.
It's very good that you fess up to all this in the book, because it's so easy to edit your past and make it look fantastically fashionable. I think one of the early records you talked about was the Laughing Gnome, but you point out that actually that was very cool to have got the Laughing Gnome as a major favourite when you were 6.
There it is.
There it is.
There is the Laughing Gnome.
I think obviously when you're 5 or 6, you have no notion of what's cool or uncool anyway. It's one of those things. I think I talk about this in the book. The day I went to secondary school, I went into shock, because I realized that there was these notions of musical tribes, and there were all these kids in my class that were only listening to the ska specials, the madness, the big. There were the kids who were listening to the new wave of British heavy metal. There were kids that were listening to and dressed up like Gary Newman. And I loved it all. And I went into shock that day, because, I'm not supposed to like all of it. But I did. I liked all of it. There was a magic to pop for me. And I'm very
You're
grateful.
just as enthusiastic about Pink Floyd as you are about ABBA and ELO. And
absolutely. And I still am. I still am. And that's why I say my love of the Laughing Gnome is completely non-ironic. You know,
yes.
I genuinely think it's a great piece of novelty pop.
But also a technical thing. You must be interested by that at that age. You know, then obviously they'd speeded up the voices and done all this trickery.
Very much so, yeah. Again, that's that element of sound design, you know, was always fascinating to me. And the B-side, the other thing I was obsessed about is that the B-side was the complete antithesis of the A-side. It's this piece of morose, kind of very depressing, very dour, minor key song called The Gospel According to Tony Day. Very drony, you know. So I love that kind of yin and yang aspect of the A and the B side thing as well. I loved all of that.
It's so funny that the kind of reputation of David Bowie over the years became the man who always knew exactly what he was doing. Whereas if you listen to the early records, he never knew what he was doing.
Exactly.
He was trying anything to see if it would work. Anything that might just get a following win.
Exactly.
Precisely.
Exactly. And you know, and I think that's why it's so shocking to hear if you imagine in 1973 when it was reissued in the post-Ziggy era, it must have been really shocking to hear The Laughing Gnome by David Bowie. But there's a very similar song by Pink Floyd called The Gnome on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And I wonder if it was equally shocking for people that got into Dark Side of the Moon to hear that. I suspect not.
No, it wouldn't.
It was something about Bowie that he kind of perpetuated that image of being almost from another planet, from another dimension. That it was very shocking to hear that once upon a time he had been very careerist, you know, very kind of
absolutely.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
Space Oddity, all those things. He was trying everything. Well, of course, it's like the thing I always think about is Ziggy Stardust, when you made the whole of Ziggy Stardust, apart from one track, and then RCA said, it needs a single. And so he said, fine.
Right.
And he went off and wrote Starman. You know what I mean?
Amazing.
I'll have a hit, no trouble at all, you know. Whereas the idea nowadays that's received wisdom about David Bowie is he never did that kind of thing. He did it.
And also this notion of the novelty song. I mean, Starman is a novelty song. Space Odyssey is a novelty song.
That's true, actually.
It is.
Song, you know. So he was he was always into making, well, not always, but certainly for the first few years of his career, it was always this idea of like, what's a concept that people are going to dig? You know, that kind of novelty aspect. It's always a big part of what he did.
Tying in with the Apollo mission and all those kind of really clever things.
But also, first big hit in America, a disco record. Young Americans, fame.
Yeah,
you know, I'm going to do whatever sells, you know, what works in the market at the time. You know, he'd do that. So who was the first, apart from your buying singles from all kinds of things, who was the first people who inspired you to want to start be involved in making music yourself?
I think Jeff Lynne, because I remember a copy of Out of the Blue appearing in the house. And that would have been about the same time, 1977. And I think it was partly the fact that it was a double album. So it seemed to have this kind of epic sprawl to it that was kind of new to me. And also the fact that it had this very conceptual artwork. And it had, I don't know if you remember, you could make your own spaceship and all that stuff. There was a poster. And what I loved about it was that every song seemed to create its own musical world. Now, this is something that had obviously come from the Beatles, but I didn't really know much about the Beatles. I mean, again, I talk about that in the book. I was never introduced.
Yes, your parents didn't really like the Beatles, did they?
They just weren't interested. And so, in a way, when I did come to the Beatles later on, it was a bit of a struggle because I was hearing things like I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. And I'd already discovered Dark Side of the Moon and Karlheinz Stockhausen. It's like this, this is very twee to me. Obviously, later on, I did discover it. But anyway, the point I'm making is that having discovered Out of the Blue ELO, not knowing the Beatles at all, this idea that every song would create its own little musical universe, which kind of span off from the lyrics, was fascinating to me. And I was reading the sleeve and I was seeing, this guy does everything. What are these? What are lyrics? I didn't know what lyrics. I thought it was the sound effects. Lyrics. What's lyric? It must be all these sound effects going. He's the lyricist. He writes the songs. He produces the record. He sings. He plays. That's me. I want to do that. I want to be. If I'd known the meaning of the word auteur, I would have said, I want to be the author. And that's essentially what I fell in love with, the idea of someone, being someone who made, quote unquote, made records. whatever it took. Never wanted to be a great guitar player or a great singer. Or never had any aspirations to be, a virtuoso. Just wanted to learn just enough of everything to be able to make these magical things.
That's really interesting, because I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because an old quote of John Lennon's. He said, some people like music, I like records. And I
That's completely me.
I can kind of see that. I'm a bit the same.
Yeah, they're completely different, aren't they? It's a whole different idea.
Well, we have a whole generation now that like music, have no interest in the physical media at all.
I suppose so. Yeah. It's different.
Which is obviously a very hard thing for our generation to come to terms with, as you can see, and I can see you guys too. We both have an affinity with the physical sort of manifestation of music, if you like. We're being able to hold it to our hearts, and it's very hard to get around. It's very hard for me to come to terms with the idea that a lot of people don't have that music for them is just something that's ones and zeros streaming off a server somewhere. I don't get that, but yes, I mean, I have a love affair with the album, the idea of the continuum, the 40-minute or the double album of 70, 80 minutes, the continuum of music as it unfolds. And I'm also very obsessive about not skipping tracks I don't necessarily like.
Oh, really?
It's disrespectful.
Right. Terrible.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's part of the record. I've got to.
It is. You wouldn't do it to a movie.
Exactly.
You don't speed through a boring section of a movie.
So the boring bit is as important as the exciting bits, isn't it? Really, because it's the kind of you're saving yourself.
Of it, exactly.
Yeah, partly. Although I'm contradicting myself slightly, because we started off by saying, well, yes, I have got to the point now where I'm getting rid of certain records from an artist's catalogue, but I still hold the album as an entity as kind of sacred in a way, and I will still sit there and listen through to a side from beginning to end, or an album from beginning to end, even through the tracks that I don't perhaps like very much, because I feel like, as you say, it's part of the ebb and flow. It's part of the the movie. Yeah.
So that you got a fabulous array of records behind you. Tell us, alphabetical or genre, or do you have a special system?
They are alphabetical. I don't do genre because I find there's always an artist that's impossible to classify. Like, let's think of an example. Where would you put Mahavishnu Orchestra? In jazz or rock?
Well, okay. There'd probably be a jazz rock section, wouldn't there? So depending on how advanced people were.
Where do you put Frank Zappa?
Oh, well, luckily at the end in Z.
Yes, Z with ZZ Top. Fairly easy to find.
Yes, true. Yeah,
it's always Abba ZZ Top, isn't it?
So who have you got? Who's in your A's? Who's your first? You have to know who your first is. Have you got an Aardvark album or anything? I want to know. Stephen Wilson has his first A. What is it? It's Aardvark. He's done it. It's bloody brilliant.
That's amazing.
Sir, I've never met you before, have I? We did not fix that. He has an Aardvark album.
That's fantastic.
Well, it's funny because I was going to say it must be ABBA, but then you mentioned Aardvark, and I'm like, oh fuck, yeah, I have got an Aardvark album.
So who's at the end? Is it ZZ Top?
It must be.
Go on, it's got to be ZZ Top. 2 Zs. Depends how.
Two Zs, exactly.
It's easy to,
Hey, there you go.
Yeah,
what was it? Rio Grande Mud.
Although, do you know that band?
Zzebra.
Zzebra with a double Z.
With a double Z. So
they don't quite trump ZZ Top, but they're kind of penultimate. Yeah. What is this? 1975. It's sort of disco prog, I think. Disco prog. It's a very strange record. It's
That's a group who obviously named themselves purely in order to get at the end of the alphabet, didn't they?
But failed.
As did Aardvark.
It's like by hook or by crook, I'll be first in this book. The people who used to write in autograph books and all that kind of stuff.
But Zzebra clearly failed because these top still trump them, don't they? Yeah.
Can you remember buying? There's a lovely section in the book about record shops, and one particularly called These Records, I think it is.
Yeah.
And you said at one point, said, one of my ambitions is to open a record shop, not to make any money, but just to sit there and glower at the customers and try and patronize them about their bad taste, as they did these records.
Yeah, well, I've always been terrified. I mean, I still am terrified of record store owners, particularly, and taking certain records up to the counter. I still feel like I'm being judged.
Yeah.
In a way, and because you were, I mean, I remember in those days, unless you went to sort of Woolworths or Rumbelows, where it was, the assistants didn't necessarily know what they were selling you. The sort of independent record store, like Record and Tape Exchange, that store, I still feel they sort of sneer at you when you bring in your mum's collection of Carpenter's records. I don't know, but these records, they took it to an extreme. It reminds me of my favourite scene in that movie High Fidelity, where the bloke goes into the store and Jack Black's serving and he says, "Have you got Stevie Wonders I just called to say I loved you?" "Yeah." And there's a pause. "Can I buy it then?" "No." That's going to be me. That's going to be me in my record store. Yeah, absolutely. "Have you got the new Ed Sheeran album?" "Yeah." "Can I buy it?" "No."
You should be punished for your bad taste.
So what was your plan with the book? I mean, does somebody approach you saying to write a straight autobiography? Because it's not really a straight autobiography, is it?
No, and I think that would have been a very boring book. I mean, the thing is, I've been very flatteringly, I've been asked a few times over the last 5 or 6 years to do a book, and because I've written pieces for magazines and things, sort of thought pieces about music for magazines, and I always thought a book has to be a purely autobiographical thing. And I thought, well, that's going to be very boring. It's going to be basically the story of a music nerd that ended up making music himself, and that's about it, really. And then I met Mick Wall, who kind of helped me write the book. And Mick, I sat down to have lunch with Mick one day, and he said, well, to be honest, the kind of book you're talking about, the book you think you want people to write, has been written 1,000 times. And I don't think anybody wants that book anymore. That's boring. That is boring. The book about the guy who sees David Bowie on top of the Pops giving Mick Ronson head, or Elvis Presley on Dick Clark or whoever it was, and forms a band and then has a hit and then goes into drugs and has a religious conversion, and that's so boring, that story now, because we've all read it 1,000 times. And he said, you should do a book where you just write about whatever you want. And so I ended up writing short stories. There's obviously thought pieces in there. There is autobiographical stuff in there. And I didn't really know
lists of your favorite movies and stuff like that.
Yeah. Because one of the things you get asked, once you're a musician and you've got, you start doing interviews, one of the things I've come to really have issue with is what I call lazy journalism, where they just basically want you to give a list of your favorite albums. And it's become so prevalent nowadays, list culture. So I thought, once and for all, I'll just stick them in this book, and then I'll never have to do those interviews ever again. So I have done my top 100 songs, and sort of tried to talk about those things too, but also lists of other things that people wouldn't necessarily ask me about,
Yeah. I was very struck, but particularly by the opening chapter, where you're already kind of established, but you write about the frustrations of how long it takes you to build these things up, you know what I mean, and how people get ideas about you that aren't the case. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think the main thing was for me that you're talking about the very, very last Porcupine Tree show at the Royal Albert Hall, at least the very last, up until recently. We've now reformed, but anyway, the very last Porcupine Tree show was at the Royal Albert Hall, and we'd sold it out, and it was supposed to be this great moment in my career, wonderful kind of high point in my career. But the thing that was frustrating is that people still saw us as this up and coming band that had yet to break through, and yet we'd been doing that for over 15 years by that point, and it was our 10th record, and I just felt very kind of used up. I had nothing left to say with that band, And yet there was always this kind of mantra with every album, oh, the next one's going to be the one. And to an extent, I still get that. You know, I'm 54 now, and so I've given up thinking that there's ever going to be the big breakthrough moment, you know. But I've also sort of, you know, lost interest in that happening anyway. I'm no longer that person. But at the time, there was always this sense that just one more record, one more tour. And it felt like a real war of attrition. And there was that kind of disillusion at that point that I didn't ever intend to get stuck in that kind of cycle of just chasing the breakthrough record. And yet everyone around me was kind of talking about that. So I kind of ran in the opposite direction at that point. Yeah. So right. I kind of put you right into the middle of that kind of thought process, which was really happening on stage. I mean, I was
it's really interesting.
Yeah.
There's so many interesting points in the book. There's one towards the end where you talk about social media. It really interests me. You're saying that social media depended on proving to people kind of how kind of normal you were. Because the way you connect with people on social media is they're just like me. We have something in common. Whereas the whole notion of rock stardom is the opposite. It's these people are supernatural beings with whom you have nothing in common, but you really, really kind of idolize them. And I thought that was a really...
Yeah, but I think that's...
destroying that idea of stardom.
Yeah, I think again that's changed now, hasn't it? So kind of rock stars. I mean, Ed Sheeran is the modern equivalent of a rock star, a guy that looks like anyone and has very little, to me, very little in the way of what I associate with, you know, the charisma that I would associate with the great rock stars. Has none of it.
Yeah.
He very much is an everyman, and that seems to be what people want now. So again, that's kind of been a little bit hard for me to come to terms with, having grown up with, you know, people like Freddie Mercury and David.
But also grown up with the music papers. The music papers helped create that idea of these mythology, fabulous cartoon characters, really. And
of course, it was ridiculous and it was absurd and it was all artifice and mirror. You know, it was artifice, but I loved it because of that. You know.
Yeah.
So I mean, my idol when I was a kid was Prince, and Prince was along with Michael Jackson and Madonna, the three great sort of 80s icons, they had that sense of otherness, which I loved. I loved that sense of otherness. Also, people like Morrissey, you know, the true kind of eccentrics, and the people that you couldn't imagine holding down any other kind of job or any other career, just born to do what they... Whereas Ed Sheeran, I could quite happily imagine him serving me and do it all, you know.
You can imagine Ed Sheeran in any job you like. You can see him.
Oh, yeah.
Working in the bank, teacher, absolutely anything. And I'm sure he'd be really good at it. But you say it's true what you say.
And it seems to be what people... I mean, my stepdaughters, they love Billie Eilish, and I think she has a similar kind of almost demystifying mystique about her. The way she dresses is... anyone can kind of imagine themselves as Billie Eilish. And that obviously is completely turning the whole notion on its head, you know, that sense of otherness that pop stars had when I was growing up, and I loved that sense of otherness, has completely disappeared, which is another thing that makes me feel, you know, like I don't understand, you know, the modern pop world. I don't want to understand it.
But you've done pretty well, though, haven't you, to be fair?
Well, so, yeah, I mean, so in a way, the book was kind of a way for me to understand that myself, because part of me, if I'm totally honest with myself, part of me has always felt like and this is where the book starts. Part of me has always felt like I've failed in a way to fulfill what I wanted to, because I did fall in love with this idea of being, you know, the dream. Growing up with people like Prince and seeing those great pop icons, you know, notwithstanding that I don't have anywhere near that talent or charisma anyway, you know, but that never stopped people, did it? So part of me was to try and understand my career myself by writing this book, because I have somehow carved out for myself a place in the music industry, which increasingly I understand is very, very unusual and very unique, because I have never crossed over into the mainstream. Even to this day, my last album, the radio just wouldn't play any of the songs on it, even though I had Elton John on one song, Nile Rodgers remixed another. They've never been interested. So
why won't they play it?
I don't know, but the honest answer is, Mark, I think they've decided that I am the guy that does prog rock.
Yeah, so you're kind of unfashionable.
or well, I don't even prog rock. I don't even think that the terms fashion and unfashionable apply anymore. I just think it's that prog rock is not something that radio stations feel like they ever, have to cover. So, although Radiohead, of course, would put the lie to that as well. But anyway, let's not get into that. But so I think this fact that I've always been a kind of outsider, and yet at the same time, I've always been, as you can tell, I've always been a student of music and the music industry and the way it works, and fascinated by that. But I've never been part of the mainstream. I've never had a hit. I understand that there is a plus side to that, which again, I talk about in the book. There are many artists I love who are defined in a fairly reductive way by one or two songs. I was talking about this with Mick the other day. Even a band like The Who, you and I would say, oh, well, The Who, they got 20, 30 classic songs. But actually, most people only know two songs now.
Yeah. Barbara O'Reilly.
Yeah. Because it's the theme to, is it NCIS or something?
Something like that, yeah.
And it's the same with a band like The Police. I would think The Police, loads of songs. Okay, go on Spotify, look at the figures.
It's one song.
One song.
No, it's Every Breath You Take.
Yeah.
And then Every Breath You Take, and then everything else almost might as well not exist.
So now this is interesting. Because I've had a theory for a number of years, and I've tested this on loads of songwriters, really successful songwriters. In the end, it's one song.
Yeah.
Because that was the theory with Sting. I tried this with Sting's publisher years ago. I said, is it one song? He says, yeah, it's Every Breath You Take.
I would think it'd be Roxanne. Okay.
No, it's Every Breath You Take because it's been sampled. It's absolutely all over the place. You'll hear it on every radio station in the world. Right. Will play Every Breath You Take.
Stranglers is a really good example.
Stranglers is
Golden Brown is 99% of their earning, and then everything else.
Gary Campett's True. You find that now you haven't got a song like that, have you?
No.
But that could be a good thing.
Well, maybe it is a good thing. I mean, Gary's a very good friend. I mean, he makes a lot of money from gold as well.
All right, okay. Yeah.
Gold is endlessly sinkable to
yeah.
Olympic medal.
Yeah,
anyway,
that's true. Yeah.
So he's
probably
got a couple.
Cereal ads. Yeah.
So he's got a couple actually. He's doing all right. But I mean, I don't have those, and I think it is a be careful what you wish for situation, isn't it? Because to have your whole career reduced, I mean, I guess even Jeff Lynne, it's Mr. Blue Sky, isn't it?
It will be.
Yeah.
Or Don't Bring Me Down. Maybe he's got a couple, but to have your whole career reduced to just one or two songs, I think I would find that really irritating.
It would be incredibly, Elvis Costello, Oliver's Army. I mean, it's
We were talking about it earlier yesterday, weren't we? I read a piece about Rolling Stones where they referred to as "Start Me Up" hit makers.
That's right. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
That's bizarre.
The Beatles being known as the Hey Jude hit makers.
It's funny, isn't it? Because sometimes it's not the song that you and I would think. Like with Queen now, I think it's "Don't Stop Me Now."
Oh, really?
Right.
It's moved. It's changed. Okay, you might be right.
Because my kids, if I say to them, "What's a Queen song?" They're 10 and 8. If I said, "You know what Queen song?" They'll say, "Don't Stop Me Now" and "We Are the Champions." And again, it's the endless syncop. I know there isn't such a word, but you understand syncability of a song like that. And I think that's the same, with a lot of these artists. It's which songs actually lend themselves to getting synced in TV show. Mr. Blue Sky, endlessly synced.
Yeah, absolutely.
Katrina and the Waves, Walking on Sunshine.
Well, Walking on Sunshine is the classic case.
Absolutely
classic. Because I spoke to Kimberly Rue about this. I wrote a piece about this. I was fascinated by it. He said, if you're going to write a summer song or a Christmas song, a summer song's always better because it's always summer somewhere.
Right. Or somebody always wants it to be summer.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it gets used in movies all the time when they want to switch to the scene from winter to summer. Right. So it always starts with a shot of somebody water skiing or driving to the beach when you want to change the mood in the movie.
Even High Fidelity, again, a kind of voguish movie. Doesn't that pivot around Walking on Sunshine?
It probably does.
It's
been used thousands of times.
But that's interesting to me that sometimes because Don't Stop Me Now, I'm old enough to remember that wasn't a big hit. It wasn't a big hit. I don't even think it made the top 10. And the same is true now. I've noticed recently, I keep seeing 10cc's The Things We Do for Love.
Yes.
I've seen it in about 3 movies or 3 TV shows over the last 6 months. I'm not kidding. And that song seems to be now, I mean, again, it wasn't a big hit at the time.
No.
Great song. It's a great song. But it seems like it's going to usurp I'm Not in Love as the definitive, reductive 10cc.
But so the optimistic take on this is what happens nowadays is records can be hits years after they've been made, and they can be hits by nothing as a consequence of nothing the artist has done or anybody has done on its behalf. It just somehow pops up somewhere. So you may have one that is still yet to happen, and it may be something you made 15 years ago and you don't even know.
You know what? And that is quite possible. And I think it's always down to TV or movie syncs these days, pretty much. So yes, you're absolutely right. The right movie sync, the right TV sync, a particular song could suddenly take off from it. I mean, I'm not holding my breath, you know.
No.
And you make the point in the book that you've managed to have a really significant amount of success, but by managing to do everything wrong. Is this what you mean? But you've just been completely unconventional about it all.
Well, I haven't. I mean, when I say everything wrong, by the way, the music industry would you know, the kind of the blueprint, if you like, is, you know, you get a song on the radio, you have a big hit, that sells the album, that sells the tour, etc., etc. And for me, it's always been the complete other way round. You know, and I'm not the first artist to you know, to make a successful career by touring. I mean, I think of a band like Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead never really had a song either. They don't have a song, do they? No. But they are, or at least they were, one of the most successful live acts, one of the highest grossing live acts, you know, in history. So there is a precedent for this kind of thing. So I did it all wrong. I chose to make a style of music that was as unfashionable as it was conceivably possible to be at the time I started in the early 90s. And I've continued to kind of plow that conceptual rock kind of furrow, if you like, albeit very eclectic within that in terms of the different styles I've used in the music. But it's always been this idea of conceptual rock music. And of course, now I find myself in an age where I find it very hard to even listen to 2 songs in a row by the same artist. So couldn't be further away from the zeitgeist in that respect. But still, I love to do it. And I find that there are people out there that still love that. And so you become, in a way, the alternative. I mean, in many ways, I could argue I'm the most alternative act of my generation. Because I have always provided the alternative to what was hip or what was successful commercially at the time, and continue to be that.
Right. So what's your next musical project? Whatever.
So Porcupine Tree is making at least one final album, and we're going to do a sort of you know, this is, again, I talk about this in the book. We're bigger now than we've ever been. We've come back and we're playing the O2 Arena and we're playing big stadiums and we're doing this arena tour, and I think that's probably going to be it. And then I'm going back to my solo career, and I've got a new record I'm writing now. Again, very different. I love this. You know, this again is something I got from all those artists I grew up listening to. I love the idea that every album kind of earns its place in the catalogue, that it's not simply more of the same. And the reason I mention that is I think I've also paid a price for that, because I always turn off as many fans as I turn on, if you see what I mean. So that idea, you're constant, and again, this is the Bowie thing, isn't it? You're constantly reinventing yourself, and in doing so, you're alienating as many of your fans as you are attracting new ones.
Yes.
And that's such a hard thing to pull off. And somehow I seem to have just about managed to do it.
But ultimately, if you carried on doing the same thing, you will eventually alienate all of them, probably.
Well, and this is what I say in the book, because ultimately, you know, people just say, well, I don't need to buy the new Steve Wilson album because it's just another version of what. So and I call it the impossible tightrope in the book, trying to walk that impossible tightrope between fan expectations and artistic integrity, and, you know, not wanting to cater for the audience, but also wanting to try and bring them along with you if you can. And that still remains the case for me. So this album I'm working on right now is very different again. I'm sure some fans are going to be upset with me, as they always are. Another reason to completely avoid social media.
Do you when you're on stage, do you look down to see how things are going over?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think that's something that's very hard. If you're on stage and you're playing, so let's say you're playing to 2,000 people, and 1,999 of them are going absolutely nuts and loving every minute, and there's one person
you would become obsessed by that one person with their arms folded.
The show, this fucking show is just for you now, just for you. I don't care about all this. You're gonna, and it's usually, you know, it's usually the girlfriend of somebody who's been dragged along.
Yes,
they're suffering. You know, they're suffering from insomnia, or they've just got, they're jet lagged. And there's probably a perfectly good explanation why they're yawning their way through it or nodding off, but it's unacceptable. It's almost like they don't. It's almost like they don't realise that you can see them.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You're right there. You're in the front row. You're fast asleep. Yeah. So yes, is the answer to your question.
How was it? Just very briefly, how is it when you do all that remixing work? Because you were obsessed with XTC. And then to the extent that you all had sort of Dukes of Stratosphere names, didn't you, in the band? And then you finish up remixing their albums. That must have been very thrilling, wasn't it?
Well, XTC, another great example of a lot of the things we've been talking about, really, aren't they? You know, the great underachievers, not by design, but the great underachievers in the sense that I think they were, if you look, I mean, you know, post-punk was really the kind of music I really first became obsessive about. It was my era. And XTC, you know, arguably the most creative of all. They were the Beatles of that scene in a way. And yet I don't know if most, you know, well, actually, no, there is a kind of reductive version of XTC. It's the Making Plans for Nigel version of XTC, isn't it? Yeah. That's the only song they ever had, which ironic was one of the few songs.
Not one of Andy's.
Not one of Andy's, yeah. And I love Andy, and I just think he's a genius, and he's a super nerdy guy, and I see a lot of myself in him. I mean, he grew up obsessed with those sort of late, you know, bands like the Chocolate Watch Band and Strawberry Alarm Clock. That, you know, a lot of what he did was him emulating those groups. And, you know, I think one of the great unwritten things about pop music is everything is, in a way, very vampiric. Everyone is, nothing comes from a vacuum. Nothing comes from a vacuum. Everything is ripped off, whether it's Led Zeppelin ripping off Chicago Bluesmen or the Beatles ripping off American rock and roll records. Everything is essentially, you know, starts from the point of view of it being a copy of something else. And it's really a question of how strong, how big is your personality to be able to transcend that imitation.
We should try our recent theory on the podcast about the Smiths. Dave pointed out that the Smiths is one of the very few groups where you can't see where they're coming from. Could you work out where the Smiths came from?
That's interesting. I mean, I can hear Johnny Marr's influence from the Byrds and things like that. But Morrissey is truly, I think, unique, isn't he?
Yes.
He really is.
You're right.
There's nobody that sounds like that.
That's the one exception that proves it. I mean, you know, but Morrissey was a big fan of people like Ron Mayle, wasn't it? Is it Ron or Russell, the singer? Russell's the singer, isn't he? Yeah. He was a big fan of things like Russell. And who's that guy that talking about great underachievers? The guy that was he kind of did the androgynous thing that Bowie.
Jabriath?
No. Jabriath.
Yeah.
Jabriath. He was a big fan of Jabriath, wasn't he? And you can hear a little bit, but the voice is just unique, isn't it? It is unique.
It is. So looking on the bright side, if you'd had one great huge hit, you would no doubt have ended up in court like Ed Sheeran is in court at the moment. You know what I mean? Because where there's a hit, there's a writ. Whereas,
and I'm sure you can hear that in my influences. You know, I'm not saying I wear them on my sleeve. I think I did when I started. Most people do. You know, and I'm sure that people can hear the influences. You know, when people say to me, "What are your influences now?" I like to say my biggest influence is my back catalogue. In a kind of negative way, because I'm trying not to repeat what I've done in the past. So in a way, it becomes an influence in itself. Like, what can I do that's not like what I've already done? So that is a big influence. But yeah, I'm sure people can hear well, they do. But, you know, again, I think it's unfortunate that a lot of modern music journalism I read is just like a list of what the band reminds the journalist of.
Yeah.
And I think that's a shame. I think that's a shame. Yeah.
Well, it's because it's very hard to write about music, so people tend to write about references.
Write careers instead. What groups look like, and their CVs. A lot easier, really.
Yeah. I guess
so. Look, we traditionally finish these chats by asking people to tell us what is the greatest record ever made.
Well,
I feel sure that
you can give us the top three if you want. But
you did mention this when we were setting this up that I was going to do. Now, I guess my question to you is: this objective or subjective?
Well, totally up to you. That's true, because I mean, it's either something you feel very passionately about, or often people tend to go for the Byrds or the Beatles or whatever, you know.
Well, I have an answer for both. I think Dark Side of the Moon is probably the most perfect record ever made. Certainly in the conceptual rock milieu, which of course I'm very much rooted. That I think it's a perfect record. I don't ever want to hear it again as long as I live, because I heard it too many times when I was growing up, and I think it's a masterpiece. It's a work of genius. It's a perfect record, but I don't want to hear it ever again. My favorite record of all time. I have two answers. Now, if you've read the book, you'll have read about this record.
Oh, is it the Christmas record?
Oh, right.
It is.
Yes.
Yeah. Explain why you like that. Well, give us the title of it again.
It is Swinging in a Winter Wonderland by the Hilton Heirs with the Tony Mansell Singers. And it's on the...
There is actually a picture of you with that record in the book, isn't there?
There certainly is, yeah.
So what was it about that appealed?
Well, I can tell you straight away. It's nostalgia. It takes, whenever I hear it, it takes me right back to my happy place. Growing up, Christmases with my mum and dad and my brother as a child. And I think so much of what we love about music, of course, is bound up with nostalgia, isn't it? Taking us back to a place that we love. And so I get that from this album. It's made by a bunch of anonymous session musicians. It's beautifully produced. I love the combination of easy listening, with classic Christmas carols. I would never argue that it's a musical masterpiece, but it probably is the record I've played more than any other in my life. And how about that? What else can I tell you?
Perfect answer.
My other favorite record of all time is Tangerine Dream's Zeit, which is I think it's the first genuine ambient, 1972.
Right.
Long before Brian Eno coined the phrase, this is proto ambient music, and I never get tired. Never get tired of this record, and I listen to that a lot too. So there you go.
Very good.
Really
Those
good.
are excellent answers, both of them.
They are. And
Word in Your Attic, a Zoom with a View.